Brilliant, thank you, Tom. Waymaker, miracle worker, that's who you are. And it fits into this idea of being a season where we set our sights on things that are above, focus on Jesus and who he is and what he offers us. And what we're going to do for the next few weeks is each week we're going to focus on Jesus. We're going to look at a story of Jesus in interacting with people, because I think that in these times it's going to be really, really helpful for me and helpful for you. And so what we're going to do is focus on a story where Jesus interacts with two people. And these people, one's called a woman, one's called Jairus, and they're at opposite ends of the social spectrum, as it were. You've got Jairus, a community leader, a social leader, and a woman who's completely rejected. And what we're going to do is just chat through this story, offering a few reflections as we go. And what we're going to find out, I'm going to give you the punchline that we're going to come to the end of, is this, that what the woman finds out and what the Jairus finds out by the end of the story is this, that it's always more with Jesus. That's what Jesus is going to lead them on to discover, that it's always more with Jesus. And I want to offer this story to you this morning and encourage you to maybe ponder it through coming weeks. And maybe you might discover the same thing in your own journey, that it's always more with Jesus. And the story starts in Mark chapter 5 verse 21. I'm just going to talk us through it and make some reflections. And it starts with Jairus, this community leader. It says he's the synagogue leader, which means he would have had civic responsibilities. He was a man of authority, a man of prominence. And he comes to Jesus and he throws himself at Jesus' feet. Just imagine that, this community leader, and he throws himself at Jesus' feet and he says, Jesus, my little daughter is dying. Will you come and lay your hands on her and heal her? And then as a father, his phrase there, my little daughter, it's this affectionate, this desperate affectionate phrase that he says, Jesus, will you just come? Will you come and heal and help? And it's interesting, isn't it, this community leader, this guy who's got social prominence, but in his hour of need, he's driven to Jesus. And maybe you found that. I've certainly found that in these days and in my own life, that need drives me to Jesus. That when I'm faced with something that I can't handle, it's too big, that it drives me to Jesus, maybe with my pain or my grief or my anxiety or my fear and my worry, my problems. It drives me to Jesus. And that's exactly what we've got here with Jairus. He gets driven to Jesus. And what do you think happens when you're driven to Jesus? Well, how does Jesus respond? And it says that it says Jesus went with him. That Jairus throws himself at Jesus' feet and said, Jesus, my little daughter, she's dying, will you come? And it says these words, and Jesus went with him. You know, when we come to Jesus in our need and we're desperate, Jesus goes with us. Maybe you're in that place this morning. Jesus will go with you. And you can imagine Jairus at that time, when he gets that sense of Jesus coming with him, how Jesus might just infuse him with hope. You know, if Jesus is going to come with me, then it's going to be okay. You know, instead of pain, he's got this sense of peace. You find it in Mark. We're in Mark chapter 5, verse 21, and we're going to read right through to verse 43 through this story. And you've got Jairus, and Jesus is going with him, so all's going to be well. And you'd imagine that could be the end of the story. Jesus goes with him and he fixes everything. But then this woman breaks into the story as Jesus is going to meet with his daughter and with Jairus, that this woman comes. And it says this woman who has suffered with bleeding for 12 years. Now, I've only been in lockdown for a week or two. You know, this kind of global crisis. It's only been a couple of weeks, but it already feels like an eternity for me. And this woman, she's been in crisis. She's suffered bleeding for 12 years. And not just the physical problem of bleeding, it said financially, she's spent all she can trying to get a solution. So financially, she's destitute. And also in that culture, if you're bleeding and you're a woman, it means you're unclean. It means that socially you'd be ostracized. She experiences social isolation, but everybody else doesn't. She's just on her own, isolated. So for 12 years, she's got this suffering and this pain. And it says that she'd heard about Jesus. We don't know what she'd heard. Maybe she'd heard something. She'd heard rumours. She heard stories of what Jesus could do. And through the crowd, she has this desperation. And she has this idea that if only she can get to Jesus. Just like Jairus, in her pain and in her hurt, she just thinks, if only I can get to Jesus. If only I can get to Jesus. And in the crowd, she gets there and she reaches out from behind him, it says, and she touches his robe. And it's interesting, isn't it? She just has this simple, superstitious faith. And there's nothing in the Bible that says if you've got a leader, a religious leader, and you touch his gown, he's got spiritual power. You know, none of that's there. But she just has this simple, superstitious faith. And here's the interesting thing. It says that she was healed. She had this simple, superstitious faith. She thought, if I just get to Jesus, if I just touch him, and she's healed. Sometimes when we come to Jesus, and maybe you're new to Hope Church, maybe you're watching this and you wouldn't normally go to church, maybe the crisis has driven you to Jesus, and you're thinking, is it enough? I don't understand enough about the Bible. I'm not sure my thoughts are quite right. I don't know enough. Maybe I've not lived a good life. I've not been to church. I've just got this simple faith that I know if I get to Jesus, it might be okay. And is it enough? And Jesus' response to this woman is that it is. That even that simple faith, she gets healed. And I've got my notes here, so give me a second to move that over. And you would think for this woman that that's enough. The story ends at that point. She wanted to be healed. She came to Jesus and she gets healed. But Jesus stops. And Jesus says, who touched me? Because there's always more with Jesus that we'll find out. He said, who touched me? And his disciples are like, what are you talking about? Who touched you? There's this kind of crowd all around. And it says this, it says, Jesus kept looking around. So you got this crowd, you got Jairus wanting to go after daughter. I mean, can you imagine you're Jairus at this point? You've got this fear, will Jesus help me? You come to Jesus, you say, Jesus, my daughter, she's sick, will you come? And Jesus says, yes, he'll come. And so you go from fear to hope. Jesus is going to come, it's going to be okay. And now Jesus has stopped, this woman's got healed, and he wants to know who it is. And imagine Jairus, the fear and the anxiety. But in the midst of Jairus and the woman and the crowd, you just have Jesus. And he just has a sense of poise and calm, and he's just looking around and he's just saying, who was that? Power went out, who touched me? And in the midst of all the story, you just get this sense of Jesus, that he's in control. That he's full of wisdom and knowledge, and he just knows what's going on. He knows the right thing to do. You know, if you come to Jesus and you cry out in his need, he's not panicking. He's not at a loss. He's not looking around thinking what's going on. He's fully in control. And he says to this woman, he says to the crowd, in fact, who touched me? And as he's doing that, the worst thing happens. The news comes to Jairus and they say, the delay, your daughter's died. There's no point in troubling Jesus now. The worst has happened for Jairus. Did you hear those words? They came and they said, listen, your daughter's died. There's no need to trouble Jesus now. They thought that when the girl was dying, you could trouble Jesus because he could heal. But now that the daughter's died, there's no point in troubling Jesus because death's bigger than Jesus, is what they're saying. That he could maybe heal her if she was ill, but now she's dead, then there's no point in troubling Jesus because it's just too big. For those of you who know the story, we know that actually even death is not too big for Jesus. But they don't believe that at this point. And when we think that it's too big for Jesus and we look at whatever it is, maybe it's death, maybe it's a global crisis, maybe it's the amount of work we've got to do because we work in the NHS, maybe it's we're worrying about elderly parents, maybe it's our mental health, or whatever it might be, we look at that and we start to worry. And we've got Jesus on the other side. And one of the questions is it too big for Jesus? Is it too big for Jesus, the things that are troubling you? And the men who were with Jairus, they thought it was. Don't trouble Jesus because this is death. Even death is not too big for Jesus. Even after death, there's resurrection. Through Jesus' life and his death and resurrection, he conquered even that. And if he can conquer that, then surely he can conquer all things. Surely he can conquer all things. And then Jesus turns round and he looks at Jairus, who's been told not to trouble him because his daughter's died and it's too much for Jesus. And Jesus turns round and says this to him. He said, Jairus, do not be afraid. Just have faith. It's the same thing again. Jesus, he's got this poise and this wisdom and the knowledge, and he's fully calm and he's fully in control, and he knows what God's doing, and he knows that God's good. And he looks at Jairus and he says, don't be afraid. Just trust me. Don't be full of fear. Don't be full of worry. Don't panic. Jairus, just look at me. And maybe Jairus wants to look at his situation, and Jesus is saying, just look at me. Don't be afraid. Don't worry. Don't panic. Now, his daughter's just died. It doesn't get much worse than that. Even when his daughter's died, Jesus is saying, look at me. Don't be afraid. Don't worry. Just have faith. Because what he's going to find out is that there's always more with Jesus. He came to Jesus because he wanted his daughter to be healed. And Jesus says, don't be afraid. And he goes with him to his daughter. And he takes her and he says, little girl, rise up. And he lifts her up. And Jesus resurrects her. He raises her from the dead. And all he said to Jairus is, you just need to trust me. Can you see how it's always more with Jesus? Can you see what happened? That Jairus came, and what he wanted is for healing. He wanted his daughter to be healed. And Jesus said, listen, I'm going to come with you. Jesus got delayed, and he said, don't worry, I'm all in control. Everything's going to be fine. And then he came to her, and he got resurrection. I mean, if you had a choice between healing and resurrection, which would you choose? Would you want a small miracle of being healed, or a great miracle of being risen from the dead? Can you imagine Jairus for the rest of his life having that story and telling his daughter that story? Can you imagine what that did to his faith and to his strength and to his confidence and his belief in God? Can you imagine what joy? Can you imagine all the other problems he faced in his life? And whenever he faced anything else, he could just remember that if Jesus can conquer death, then he can conquer even this. It's always more with Jesus, that we come with our need, but he wants to offer more. But in order for Jesus to give more, he's got to ask for more. Do you see what happened there with Jairus? That Jesus said, I want to give you more. I want you to experience your daughter rising from the dead. But in order for you to get that, you need to trust me. Don't just trust me when your daughter's ill, but trust me when she's dead. Trust me in the most difficult of circumstances. And there's something about trusting Jesus that opens the door to more. There's something about when we go through difficult times, if we trust Jesus, that it can actually open to more joy and more trust and more faith and more peace. And interesting, exactly the same thing happened for the woman. Exactly the same thing. That she's in this situation. Notice what happens with the woman. She comes to Jesus because she wants to get healed. And she gets healed, but Jesus stops and he's like, who's touched me? Who is it that touched me? And the disciples are saying, what are you talking about? And the woman, who could have disappeared into the crowd, chose to reveal herself. Now, because this woman, what you need to understand is, because this woman was bleeding, what that meant was that she was unclean. She shouldn't have been in the crowd. It meant that everybody she touched would have been made unclean. It meant she was going to get revealed as touching a religious leader. So when Jesus said, who touched me? What she's inviting is for her to reveal herself to everybody. And when she reveals herself, what she's going to get is shame. And she's going to get ridicule. She's going to get probably abuse. Maybe it might turn violent. It's quite possible in women in those days it would turn to violent and she would die. And Jesus invites her to reveal herself. And so she does. She said, it was me who touched you. And she shares her story with Jesus. And then Jesus, who'd asked more from her, because he'd asked her to reveal herself in front of everybody. He'd asked her to open herself to shame and to ridicule in front of everybody. And the reason that Jesus had asked more, he'd asked her for faith, he'd asked her to trust him, trust me, is so he could give more. See, it's always more with Jesus. When we come with our needs, we come with our problems, he's going to ask us to have faith and to trust him. Even through the most difficult circumstances, he's going to say, don't fear, still trust me. Trust me in your darkness. And with this woman, trust me with your vulnerability. Trust me with your social reputation. Trust me with your shame. Because he's got more for her. She just wanted physical healing, but Jesus had so much more. And look at what he says to her in the passage. He says this to her. When she's revealed herself and she's told herself, and everybody's looking around her with a sense of shame and anger, maybe some people have started to pick up stones, they were going to stone her, and Jesus looks at her and says, daughter. It's the same word. Jairus talks about his daughter, and now Jesus is saying, you're a daughter of faith. He said, daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace. You don't need to suffer. He gives her an identity where she's in social isolation, where she's excluded. Her bleeding for 12 years has excluded her. And what Jesus has said, actually, you're not just physically made well, but you're included. And you may be watching this today and thinking, well, I'm not really a church person. I'm not kind of a religious person. I'm not really that good. I've lived in all sorts of life. Is this for me? Is this, could I be included? And Jesus said, yeah. Whatever you've done, you can be included. Whatever experience of rejection you have, I want to include you. And he says, your daughter, I want to give you a new identity. I want to remove your sense of shame. I want to remove your sense of exclusion. I want to include you. And then he says, your faith has made you well. And I was praying about this message. I was praying about you yesterday, last night. I was walking in the field and I was just pondering this story. And I would encourage you to do that this week. Just ponder this story. There's so much to it. And I was pondering this phrase where Jesus says, your faith has made you well. And initially I thought he was talking about physically, because she had faith physically by touching his robe, that she was made well. But then I thought, actually, I don't think he's talking about that. He's saying your faith has made you well. Your trust in me. You're revealing yourself in front of everybody when I asked to. You're trusting me with your social reputation in your life. And it's made you well because I'm giving you a new identity. It's got rid of your shame. You see, we need a saviour. We need somebody to save us. And coming to Jesus, the barrier is we've got to be vulnerable and we've got to say, actually, I need Jesus. I can't do this on my own. And then he says to her, your faith has made you well. Now, I don't want to be somebody who on YouTube disagrees with Jesus, because I believe he's the Son of God. I think he's full of knowledge, but I do want to disagree with Jesus. Because he says your faith's made you well. Now, her faith hasn't made her well, has he? It's Jesus who's made her well. It's Jesus' power who's done it all. It's Jesus who's given her a new identity. It's Jesus who said, daughter. But what he means is, because of your faith, because of your trust in me, because of your vulnerability, because you're prepared to take a risk, because you can set out your comfort zone, then what that does is it releases the power of Jesus. And he wants to affirm it in front of everybody, in front of all these religious people, from all these people who've done the right thing. He says, listen, because you trusted me, because you've trusted risk, then actually that's enabled my work in your life. He wants to affirm her response, and he wants to affirm what she's done. And she gets so much more. She gets inclusion, she gets acceptance, she gets affirmation from Jesus, and all she wanted is to be physically healed. It's always more with Jesus. But he's the challenge. In order to get the more from Jesus, so for Jairus, the more was resurrection of his daughter. For the woman, although she came for physical healing, the more was acceptance, and she got included, she got affirmed by Jesus. They both got more. But in order to get them more, and it's a kind of principle of the kingdom, it's a way of how life works with Jesus, is in order to get them more, the way in is faith. The way in is to trust Jesus. And sometimes that involves all sorts of risk of doing things that we don't want to do. Sometimes it means I'm going to trust you with my life. Sometimes it means I'm not going to look at the news. I'm going to focus on you. I'm not going to live in fear. I'm going to live in faith. I'm going to live with your peace rather than with panic. And it's focusing on Jesus. And it's that faith that can release the blessing and the more. And that's really difficult at times. It's really difficult to step into what God's got for us. But here's what I've discovered. Here's what the woman discovers. Here's what Jairus discovers, is that Jesus is this man, this son of man, this son of God who has so much more. And he's got wisdom, and he's got knowledge, and he's in control, and he's full of peace. And so we can trust him when he asks us to. And the way to have faith is not to be trying to positively think. It's not to kind of will up faith. It's not to kind of think, right, I mustn't fear, I mustn't panic, I must have faith, I must. Because that's faith in faith. That's relying on yourself. That's thinking that you can do it. The way to have faith is simply this, and you might want to use this as a spiritual exercise this week. It is, you've got your problems over here, and you've got Jesus over here. And faith is simply not looking at that, but looking at him. Yeah, it's just a decision that we make. We think, well, who is Jesus? What's he like? And maybe you don't know because you're not familiar with Jesus particularly. Well, get the book of Mark in the Bible and just read the book of Mark. It says that the woman heard about Jesus. And by hearing about Jesus and focusing on and reading about him, read this story again that I've talked about today in chapter 5. And just see Jesus and how in control he is and how much wisdom and knowledge. And what happens when we don't look at our problems? Well, hang on a second. What happens when we do look at our problems is fear rises up. When we read the news, we start to panic. When we think more and more of the worst case that could happen, it has all sorts of negative effects on us. But when we look at Jesus and we think, well, Jesus is in control. Jesus isn't in lockdown. Jesus is full of wisdom. Jesus knows what's best. Jesus is someone I can trust. Jesus has conquered death by his resurrection. When we look at that, what we find is faith starts to rise. We don't will faith up by looking at him. And maybe in this season, maybe Jesus has got more for you. Maybe Jesus has got more for me. Maybe in this season, Jesus is going to ask you to trust him. Maybe he's going to ask you to trust him with your elderly relatives. Maybe he's going to ask you to trust him with the future. Maybe like Jairus, you find that in this crisis you get stripped away and stripped down, and that makes you vulnerable, and Jesus is asking you to lean into him in this season. But what you find is when you do that, there's always more with Jesus. I don't know what the more is for you. I don't know what he's got for you in this season, in this crisis, but I know that he's good. I know he's full of grace and kindness. He'll do all sorts of stuff. Maybe he's going to strengthen the relationships you've got with people because he's going to invite you to phone them every day. Maybe he's going to invite you to be less selfish and to give things away for others. Maybe he's going to deepen your prayer life. You're going to use those 4 Ps and you're going to be someone who prays every day for our nation, for our politicians, for healing for people. Maybe you're going to get a prayer life like you've never had it before. Maybe with the space that you've got, you're going to invest in your kids' life, in their spiritual life. Who knows what might happen? But my encouragement for you in this season is to focus on Jesus. Focus on the sort of person he has. Focus on what he's got for you. Maybe reflect on this story. Because it's our need that takes us to Jesus. Because we're desperate. But then as we trust him, maybe he invites us to have more faith. Maybe he invites us to do crazy things like believe him when all sorts of things are falling apart. Maybe what you'll find is that it's always more with Jesus. Maybe that might be true in these days for me. And maybe it might be true in these days for you. Let me pray for you. Let me pray for me in these times. Father, we just thank you that in these times of chaos that you're somebody with poise and wisdom and knowledge. And as things hit you, that you're not in lockdown. You're not spinning, wondering what goes on. And will you help each of us, for every person who's watching this, will you help us to focus on you? Help us to get that sense of faith rising. When you ask us to trust you, to lean into you, even when circumstances says we shouldn't, even when it's costly, will you give us strength to obey you? Will you give us a focus on you? So that as individuals, as a community, as a nation, we may discover that it's always more with Jesus. Amen. Amen. Thank you for your encouragement, everybody. That brings our service to a close. Appreciate you taking part in our prayer and our praise. And we're going to be out here next Sunday at 11, trying to do all sorts of things to help you worship and help you focus on God. And please like this, subscribe to it, maybe share it with other people, even if it's people you know who don't go to church. Just share this message with them, and maybe God might use it to touch people. And if there's anything we can do, then please get in touch. And let's be a community that keeps shining light in the darkness, even in these days. God bless you all. I miss you. I love you all very much. See you soon. Bye-bye.